today's CAMBAM QLS talk. Our today's speaker is John Rubin from University of Pittsburgh. John is a professor in the Department of Mathematics at the University of Pittsburgh. John's research is focused on computational modeling of networks of coupled neurons. He's particularly interested in how intrinsic cellular properties combine with synaptic properties such as plasticity, architecture, and connections to generate neural activity patterns. He's currently using simulations and theoretical analysis to elucidate how the modulation of such patterns contribute to movement disorders such as Parkinson's disease and pacemaking that occurs in respiratory rhythms. He also considers more abstract questions of how various network components interact to produce complicated dynamic patterns, such as bursts and mixed mode oscillations, which is a topic that has quite a bit of interest in my lab. Jonathan is also a fellow of the Society of Industrial and Applied Mathematics. He's the editorial board of CIAM Journal of Applied Mathematics, CIAM Journal on Applied Dynamical Systems, plus Computational Biology and Biological Cybernetics. He's the chair. He used to be the chair. He just told me that he stepped down just recently, but he used to be the chair of the department, and currently he's the chair of the chair and program director of the CIAM Special Interest Group in the life sciences. So thanks, Jonathan, for giving this talk, and I look forward to hearing it. So the microphone is yours.
Okay, thanks a lot, Anmar, and all of you for having me. As Anmar mentioned, a lot of my research is in topics related to neuroscience, but I'm going to speak about something different today, as you can see from the title. And the talk is really going to have two parts. The first part is going to introduce a problem and also has one main take-home message, and then I'm going to switch gears and talk about this topic of qualitative inverse problems, which is a sort of mathematical approach to starting from a very basic level and seeing what we can say rigorously about what we can hope to learn about ODE models from limited data. Okay, so, whoops. Okay. So, as I said, starting with introducing the general problems of interest here. So in the parameter estimation framework, the situation is that one has some sort of physical system, and one builds a model, a mathematical model to represent the physical system. So this may be PDEs, ODEs, or something else. And the model includes some parameters. So I've denoted these by P. And we're not sure about the values of these parameters that best fit the data. Okay, and the data over here in the right column is a collection of measurements taken from the physical system that you hope to model. And I'm denoting the data like this. So what I'm saying is our model includes certain dependent variables, these X components, and what we can actually measure are these quantities Y, which depend on these variables X that show up in the model. We have these at discrete time points Ti, and of course the physical system has actual parameter values, right? There's an actual temperature at which this reaction is taking place, and so on. And so those are going to also impact what sort of measurements we get. And so we have measurements, that look like something in these plots, and we want to go from there to try to figure out the parameters of the model that would allow the model to best reproduce these measurements. Okay, so expressed mathematically, the goal that I just said in words looks something like this. Right, we define a cost function, and we want to find the parameter values for the model, say p hat, over some space of eligible parameters that minimize this cost. So minimize some sort of difference between the quantities that we can measure over here and the quantities we compute from the model variables, the corresponding quantities that we compute from the model variables. And so if we explore this cost function over our parameter space, like suppose we have a two-dimensional parameter space, we will get some sort of surface. And ideally, we have some numerical method. And traditionally, the goal would be to use this numerical method to sort of travel along this cost function and find the global minimum, where we have the least deviation between model outputs and data. Okay, so this is a really nice framework. It's a really nice concept, and sometimes it works very well, but there can be some serious challenges with trying to do this. Oh, right. So I'm going to use the notation or the terminology forward for actually just taking the model for a fixed set of parameters and integrating forward to produce a solution x, and therefore, you know, these quantities y that we can compute from x. And the inverse problem that I've been describing is to go the other way, right? To go from data and a structure of a model to trying to find the best parameters for the model to fit that data. Or we could try to be even more ambitious and go from the data and try to figure out both the form of the model and the parametrization of the model that give the best fit. Okay, so as I said, this inverse problem is nice conceptually, but we can quickly run into various challenges. Okay, so over here on the right is a cost function that we generated in a particular problem of interest. And you can see it looks a lot different from this nice, you know, schematic sort of well-behaved cost function here. So this has many different comparable minima and a huge number of other minima, right? So it might be difficult to find the global minimum. And what's more, we actually might lose information from just focusing on one global minimum, because these look like they may be, you know, similarly viable solutions, at least based on the information we have so far. Likewise, it may be that there are multiple minima that kind of have the same cost, and so that's a form of non-identifiability, right? The data that we have doesn't allow us to pick which parameters are sort of better than others. This cost function also illustrates this issue of non-robustness, right? So if we were to change the data slightly, this surface would shift slightly, and all of a sudden what used to be the global minimum might not be, and a different minimum might take over. Okay, and we have to recognize that data can be noisy, right? So small changes in data might occur even if we take the same system and run it in exactly the same conditions, just because we're not able to measure with perfect precision. Okay, so there are these challenges that have led people to seek an alternative to sort of the maximum likelihood or best parameter set approach. And we can kind of group these challenges into sort of two classes of mathematical frameworks. So one is what we like to call the random measurement error model. So as I mentioned, right, the data could be noisy, possibly due to fluctuations in the physical system, possibly due to fluctuations or stochasticity in how well we can measure, how well we can take measurements from the physical system. Okay, so mathematically, we can think of this as our data is now a random variable. Okay, and this random variable depends on our choice of parameters. I've switched from P to A here, which can be mapped forward by our model. But even with this mapping, right, on top of this mapping for whatever parameters we choose, we have to add in some sort of noise term. So G here is a random variable with its own density to represent this source of noise from measurement error. Okay, so that's that deals with a subset of the challenges that I mentioned. It doesn't give us a solution to these challenges, but encodes them in this mathematical framework. And then the second case would be what we call the random parameter model. So here, in fact, we have to recognize that the parameters of the physical system that have generated our data are not just a single parameter set. Okay, we actually have a distribution of parameter values with some density. And this is a case that I haven't explicitly mentioned, but this is why I showed the mouse as one of my two example systems here. Right? So in medical or clinical settings or experiments related to medical topics, it's often the case that we take multiple measurements, but these measurements have to be from different individuals. Or even if they're from the same individual, that individual has changed over time in between the measurement collection instances, right? So maybe we can collect data from the same patient in two different years when the patient gets the flu, and it might be 6 hours into the flu case in both cases, but nonetheless the parameters have changed because that individual has aged, their metabolic conditions are different, and so on. So biology introduces this additional twist that might not be present in simpler chemical or physical systems, where we have to face that there is no one best parameter set, and we actually have a whole distribution of parameter values that we're really should be talking about finding. Okay, so of course we could combine these two frameworks. We could have heterogeneity and noise, and that would be a measurement error, a random parameter model that we could also deal with. Okay, so now we have some notation, and we've identified some problems, okay, with the sort of maximum likelihood approach to parameter estimation. And I'm going to talk about some how one can maybe deal with a better approach to this parameter estimation problem than trying to minimize a cost function. And so I realized that, speaking of minimization, I have the meeting controls hidden and all the participant and whatnot stuff minimized, so I can't actually see if anyone has a hand up or anything. So maybe if anyone has a question at any point, you could just kind of call out or something, or I'll need you to get my attention. I'm happy to answer questions along the way, but I might not be aware that they exist. Okay, so anyway, hopefully we're on the same page. We have this inverse problem that we want to solve, and we want an alternative to finding the unique so-called best parameter set to allow our model to fit some data, given that we're aware of all these complications in doing that. Okay, and so the approach, which has been around for quite a while, right? I'm not telling you anything brand new, that many people turn to get around these challenges is a Bayesian approach. Okay, so the goal in the Bayesian approach is to actually come up with a probability distribution on the model parameter space. So we're not going to be throwing out all the information. We're going to be trying to build up this entire distribution. Now that could be computationally expensive, but hopefully it'll be worth that cost. Okay, so the formula that we use to do this, Bayes' formula, looks like this, right? And so on the left-hand side, we have what we're after, right? This is the posterior distribution, right? So when we observe some data, we want to know for any possible parameter set, what's the probability that that parameter set was the right one to produce the data that we observed. Right? So that's what we're after. And to compute this, or to estimate this, we're going to use this right-hand side. Okay, so to begin with, on the right-hand side, we need to sample parameter values, and we do that according to some distribution, and that's known as the prior distribution. So for example, if our prior distribution was, you know, Gaussian centered at some value, then the most likely parameter value we're gonna guess as fitting this data will be that mean of that Gaussian, but we'll also sample parameters around the mean with whatever spread the Gaussian gives us. And then we have this term here, sometimes called the likelihood, and this is where we make use of our model. So the idea is once we've sampled parameter values, we plug those into the model, we simulate forward, and that gives us some values for the data. Okay, and so we compute this term, and depending on the model, you know, if there's noise in the model or whatever, this, you know, may itself be probabilistic or it might be deterministic, and together this sampling process together with the simulation process gives us our estimate of the posterior. Okay, and here's just a pictorial representation, right, of sort of combining the prior along with the data that would be generated for each set of parameters in the prior distribution. In this case, it's a stochastic simulation being used to produce this, and so together they would reshape the prior distribution into the posterior distribution on parameter space. Okay, so within this framework, let me show you one little example of how we put this to work in a paper some years ago. So in this experiment, what we did was we were interested in the circulatory system. Okay, so we built up a kind of simple, this is a modeling framework that's been used for many decades for some cardiac studies. Okay, so we use this relatively simple, what I think of as like a flow-based circulatory system model. So we have various compartments, they have volumes, there are pressures, there are resistances, and you sort of put that all together as this network of you know, tubes and compartments, and what you end up with in this case is a system of 5 ODEs with 19 parameters, and you're describing things like, you know, the volume of the heart as it goes between systole and diastole. You have an arterial volume, a venous volume, and various other quantities here. And then for this simple demonstration, even though there are 19 parameters in the model, we froze 17 of them. Okay, and we're only allowing 2 parameters to be free, which makes visualization really, really easy and convenient. And so the 2 free parameters in this example are going to be a contractility of the vessels and the overall intravascular volume. Okay, those are 2 model parameters. And what we did in our experiments is we either took a normal or a uniform over some bounded domain prior distribution on, you know, jointly across these 2 parameters. Okay, so this is the normal prior distribution plotted as a heat map in terms of probability that we used in these simulations. Okay, and now we suppose that we get one measurement from our patient. And so the patient comes into the clinic, the physician measures arterial pressure and finds this very low value. Okay, and so what that does in the Bayesian framework is it maps this prior into this posterior distribution. Okay, so again, we have a heat map corresponding to the probability of different parameter values, and you can see that there's kind of 2 peaks. Right? There's this large peak at low volume, okay, hypovolemia, and there's this other probability peak way down at the bottom end of the contractility range. And so this would correspond to a sort of heart failure diagnosis. Okay, so we have 2 different possible explanations from this one data point, you know, of what's happening in this circulatory system. Okay, so this is a huge gain of information. but we do still have some non-identifiability. We don't know which diagnosis is correct. The good news is by keeping a probability distribution, we've kept both diagnoses in play, so we can still choose between them. Okay, so now as a clinician, what we want to do to make use of this framework is we want to think, okay, what's a measurement we can do on this patient that will distinguish between these two possible diagnoses for what's causing the low pressure. Okay, and what we can do is to perturb the patient's circulatory system, not by giving them a fluid injection and watching what that does to the blood pressure. Okay, and so two different scenarios that we can play out in our simulations are the following. We can imagine that after this fluid application, the blood pressure measurement goes up significantly. Okay, so incorporating that in another iteration of the Bayesian parameter estimation process, right, starting now with this as our new prior and incorporating this new piece of data, changes the posterior distribution to this one. So now we just have a nice unimodal distribution, and we've established that we don't have a contractility issue, but it is hypovolemia that's causing the low blood pressure. And we can do something to help the patient accordingly. On the other hand, if this experiment leads to only a very modest increase in the blood pressure, then this lower peak in the probability distribution goes away, and all of the probability mass shifts to the low contractility state. Okay, so now we've identified that in fact there's a heart failure issue here, and that's what we need to treat. Okay, so this is, I think, a nice, hopefully clear example of how the Bayesian framework is meant to work and how it can provide really potentially useful information in a clinical setting. However, we made a mistake in this paper, in this experiment. Okay, it's not the type of mistake that requires a retraction, right? All of our code was good, everything's sound, except the mistake was that we did something non-optimal. Okay, we got away with it. Okay, in this particular example, it turns out if we hadn't made this mistake, we would have gotten the same results. Okay, but the mistake is this one. When we have, this is a case with a random measurement error model. Okay, not really. Yeah. Okay, the reason we have distributions here that are spread out and not delta distributions is because we are introducing noise into our measurements. Okay, and so yes, so sorry, I misspoke. We are in the random measurement error model framework. Okay, and so we have data. In this case, we just had two pieces of data. We had a model, and we have a certain error density that we've assumed on our measurements. Okay, and so in this case, the Bayesian posterior looks like this, right? This is just the formula I showed you before, without the denominator term, so I've made this a proportionality. Okay, and because our error density looks like this, we're going to assume that the posterior looks like this, right? So at the data value, which exactly matches the output of our model for a specific parameter set, that's going to be the peak of this density, and then the density is going to decay as a function of this difference. Okay, and in this process, as I've mentioned several times, we needed to choose a prior. Okay, and so the priors that are usually taken are the uniform prior that I mentioned before, the normal prior that I showed you, or something called the reciprocal prior. Okay, and the reason for taking the uniform prior is to try to be what's called uninformative or non-informative, right? We're making no a priori assumptions on the parameter values. Okay, so here A is a vector, and so this notation is a product over the reciprocals of the components of the vector, and this is used to try to make no prior assumption on the mean over the parameter values. Okay, so these are both attempts to be non-informative. Okay, normal is often used simply because it's convenient, mathematically or computationally. However, let's look at these schematic pictures. Okay, so let's suppose that we use this uniform prior on parameters. Okay, we have a nonlinear model in our system, right? So in this schematic, I just have a one-dimensional parameter space. So there's just one parameter. Okay, and I've chosen a uniform distribution over some range of that parameter. When I put that uniform distribution through my nonlinear model, okay, what I'm saying is a priori, I am assuming a distribution on the data, right? By choosing a uniform prior on parameters, given that I'm using a nonlinear model, I am a priori saying these data values are more likely than others. So without any actual measurements, I have imposed an expectation that certain observations are more likely than others. Okay. In fact, what we may want to do, whoops, screwed up my animation, just ignore the formula on the lower right. What we really should be doing, I would claim, is assuming a priori that we know nothing about the data, right? It's the observations that cannot be anticipated. So we should have a uniform distribution on the data space, not on the parameter space. And when we map that backwards through our nonlinear model, what we end up with is the Jacobian prior on parameters. Okay, so our prior distribution should be proportional to the Jacobian evaluated on the parameter space. And so here we have this determinant of the derivative matrix of our model evaluated on the parameters. And here it's just one-dimensional, so it's just a derivative instead of a derivative matrix. But this is the correct way to avoid making assumptions ahead of time on the data. Okay, and so this is the correct prior to use, and this is what we did not use in this paper, and in fact what most people do not use when using the Bayesian approach. Okay, so if you're not convinced by pictures, here's a quick calculation to convince you of what I'm saying. So remember, we have our random measurement model, okay, and I said that the likelihood is going to be given in this way based on the density associated with the measurement errors. Okay, and so if we want to compute the likelihood or the probability of any specific data point or observation, okay, the formula here, the Bayes formula, says we should take this probability of data given parameters times the prior distribution on parameters. Okay, and when we do this, if we use the Jacobian prior, right, so I'm plugging in j in place of pi, then using the change of variables formula, okay, what we end up with is this integral directly over all of the possible points in the data space. Okay, and since gamma is a density, this integrates to 1. Okay, so we've left out the proportionality factor, okay, which would allow Q itself to integrate to 1. But the bottom line here is this right-hand side is independent of the choice of data point that we made. Okay, so this is the mathematical calculation showing that this picture is valid when we use a Jacobian prior. Okay. Now, we are not actually the first ones to observe this, but this has really been hidden, and we put it in this framework, do the calculations to support it and do a lot of example simulations to explore its performance in a paper that we published a couple of years ago. So I'll mention my collaborators at the end of the talk, but I guess I'll mention now David Swegan, who's been my collaborator on all aspects of what I'm talking about, who's really been a great person to work with on these problems and who actually did a lot of the simulations that I'm talking about. Okay, so as I mentioned, we've explored a lot of examples of the performance of the Jacobian prior compared to others, and here's just one of these examples. Okay, so this is a really simple, almost cartoon-like model of an influenza infection. Okay, so the only three variables in this model are a viral load equation, an equation for some sort of measure of healthiness or healthy tissue, which is just decaying due to the presence of the virus. And then we have some sort of measure of infected population here. Okay, so we have recovery, and then we have this transfer from H into I. Okay, and there was data available on the viral load for these volunteers infected by flu in this study. Okay, and you can see a sort of maximum likelihood or best fit to this data displayed on a log axis from traditional methods, and this is the corresponding time courses of H and I. Okay, now if we instead use a Bayesian approach and start from either uniform, reciprocal, or Jacobian prior, okay, then we get some sort of distribution on this 5-dimensional parameter space. And if I look at the marginals, again on the log axis, over these 4 parameters, the 5th parameter here is the initial viral load. Okay, so that doesn't show up in the model, but it shows up in the initial condition here. We get very different marginals of our posterior distributions depending on which prior we choose. Okay, and this is a case where we have possible multimodality, and that's where the Jacobian can really start to matter. Okay, so again, we see these very different marginals of the posterior. So we have a very different sampling of parameter space that we are told to take when computing our posterior. And so from these 3 different priors that we started with, we then generate the posteriors and sample from the posteriors and look at the trajectories of VH and I and also log V here that we get from our samples from our posterior distribution. And you can see that the uniform is already sort of doing a pretty sketchy job on fitting the data, on keeping things constrained around the data. The Jacobian does the best job of that. What's more, the uniform and reciprocal priors have introduced these sort of spurious or extraneous ranges of parameter values that lead us to uncertainty about the time courses of H and I, the unobserved variables that we really should have been able to avoid, and that don't have any resemblance to the sort of best fit that we see here in black. Okay, so that's one of many different demonstrations I could show you of cases where we really should be using the Jacobian prior to get the best possible estimate of how to parametrize our model. Okay, so let me check the time. That's because that's the first part of the talk. Okay. Yeah, so we can also look at the random parameter model. This is one other little bit of the best part of the first part of the talk, but the bottom line here, without going through the calculation in detail, is that we should also use the Jacobian prior when we're dealing with the random parameter case. with heterogeneity actually built in to the parameter set that we can't get away from. Okay. All right, so now I'm going to switch gears. Okay. I hope you're all still with me. It's a really weird feeling just to be talking at my computer and not seeing anybody, but I'm gonna assume everything's going along fine, and keep going here. And this is also a bit awkward because this is a part of the talk where I would prefer to get a little bit of audience input. I'm not sure if there's a good way to do that here. So I'm just going to trust you to think about the answer in your head rather than waiting to be shown the answer. Okay, and I'm going to ask you a question. Okay, a couple of questions. Okay, so let me step back. All right, so in the Bayesian framework, what we tried to do from our data was actually get a representation of the probabilities of a whole distribution of parameter values. Okay, what we're going to try to do now is not actually quantitatively obtain the parameters, right? Not get their actual values, but get some sort of information about our model system from our data. Okay, so we're going to go easier on ourselves. Maybe we're not so interested in necessarily, or maybe it's not realistic to know that this parameter measures 8.3 and this other one measures 0.045. Maybe it's the best we can hope for is to say, okay, our model that produces this data has a stable equilibrium point, or this model that produces this data has periodic solutions, or something more qualitative like that. So that's what gives rise to this phrase that we've been using, the qualitative inverse problem. Okay, and to start studying the qualitative inverse problem, which to my knowledge has not been looked at very much in the literature, we decided to start all the way back at the beginning. So we're going to actually start with linear models, x dot equals ax. Okay, and I need to therefore demonstrate to you that this is an interesting problem, because linear models are used in certain areas of biology, but they're also far from what are used in most areas of biology and applied math. Okay, so let's go to the very simple case of just a 2D linear ODE model, right? So 4 coefficients in this matrix A that we don't know. Okay, now let's suppose that we know 2 measurements from this system. Okay, so X has 2 components. By abusive notation, I'm calling them X and Y. And the first measurement is here. The second measurement is here. Okay, and there's a certain time interval between these 2 measurements. Okay, and let's suppose we have a third measurement, the same time interval after P1. Let's, for example, suppose that the third measurement is here at this position A. Okay, the question that we would like to answer is, what type of critical point does this system have at the origin? And where does this trajectory go after it goes from P0 to P1 to A? Okay, and so here's the answer. This is what the trajectory does, if I can get my screen to advance. There we go. All right, so this is there's a unique parameter set for this system that satisfies the specifications on the data, P0, P1A, with equal time intervals. And this is the trajectory generated by the system that goes through these points. Okay, so now let's ask the same question, but with either B as our third data point, equal time away from P1, C as our data point, or D as our data point. Okay, and what we want to say is, what type of critical point does the system have, and what does the trajectory do after it hits either B, C, or D? Okay, so look at the trajectories and make your guesses. Not the trajectories, look at the data points and make your guesses. Okay, A corresponded to a saddle with this trajectory. Let's see. So the qualitative inverse problem asks us to figure out the answer to these questions no matter where this third data point should happen to lie. And in fact, the answer is very sensitive to the position of this data point. B is not so different from A, but we get this. Okay, C looks like it's going away from the origin, but in fact, the system that goes through C has a stable spiral point at the origin, and the system that goes through D has a stable node at the origin. Okay. B, I should have said, has an unstable node at the origin. Okay, so we can get 4 qualitatively different types of linear systems by having our third data point in these 4 different locations. And I would claim, it's a priori quite challenging to predict which data points will go along with which trajectory types. Here's another demonstration of the challenging aspect of this problem. Okay, so which of the following is the time course of this system, this linear model, that goes through these data points? Okay, so notice we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, so we have an 8-dimensional linear system, and we have roughly 8 observations of each component of that system. Okay, so which one of these is the time course for the system going through these data points? Is it this one with a stable node at the origin? This looks like a pretty good fit, right? Is it this one with a saddle point at the origin? Also looks like a good fit. Is it this one with an unstable spiral at the origin? Looks like this one goes through all the data too, right? Or maybe there is no linear system that goes through all of this data. Which is it? Okay, well, it turns out every one of these is correct. Okay, so to generate these different examples, we took this data point here, represented by the asterisks, and varied the x coordinates here by this tiny amount. Okay, less than 2% relative to a certain set of baseline values. Okay, so if we shift the data in this second point by this tiny amount, which really isn't perceptible when I vary my slides, when I go from slide to slide, these are the cases that we get. So for this case, there is a linear system that goes through the data, and it has a stable node at the origin, and it produces trajectories that look like this. In this case, there's a linear system with a saddle point at the origin, and it produces these trajectories that go through these data points, and so on. Okay, so extremely small changes in data could lead us to very different qualitative conclusions about the nature of the system that can produce this data. Okay, so with this demonstration, in fact, one might be led to think that this problem is hopeless. Right? It's actually too ambitious. But again, it's less ambitious than parameter estimation the way it's traditionally done. Right? With parameter estimation, we want to know exact parameter values, which means once we have those values, we will know what type of critical point we have at the origin for our model, for example. So this is less ambitious, but still, extremely challenging. And we want to do this as rigorously as possible, so that adds an additional challenge. Okay, so again, this is the qualitative inverse problem, and it's a mathematical problem, but I do think it's very relevant to applications because it can help us decide, is a certain class of models a reasonable one to consider for the type of data that we have? Or, as I'll show you in a later example, it can allow us to say something about the nature of the interactions of the elements or components in a system, which we might not know a priori when we just write down the model. Okay, and yeah, so it's kind of an attempt to constrain how much is it that we could actually say about a system from a certain type of data. Okay, so let's keep going. So again, these are the types of questions that we want to try to address with this approach. Right? Can a model that we're interested in even produce the observations that we see? If not, then we can rule that model out and go on to something different. If so, is the parameter vector that produces these observations unique? Maybe we can't find its value, but hopefully we can at least say if it's unique or not. And then, as I was showing you in these examples, even if we can't find P, maybe we can say something about the solution. Does it have damped oscillations or not? Is it periodic? That type of thing. And then, this last issue from this last example, how robust are our answers to small changes in the data? Okay. So here's what we have been able to show. Okay, so in fact, for linear systems, despite the challenges that I just demonstrated, we have a pretty complete story. Okay, and it appears in these couple of papers here. So we always assume, and this is something that we've only deviated from a little bit, and that's open for exploration by anyone out there. We generally assume that we have a discrete collection of data points, okay, with equal time intervals between them. So the time that passes from the measurement of x0 to x1 is the same as x1 to x2, and so on. Okay, so in notation, mathematical notation, this looks like this. Right, so x is the dependent variable vector of our model, and we're just measuring x at these discrete time points. And we assume linear independence of these data points. Otherwise, we run into some non-identifiability right off the bat. Okay, and so we're taking a linear model. Okay, we have a certain initial condition, and we know how to solve a linear model, right? So a linear model has a solution of this form, and we're going to use phi to denote its principal matrix solution. Okay, so with a special initial condition. All right, so from that starting point, okay, what we know right away is that we can map forward from one measurement to the next by iterating with the principal matrix solution phi. Okay, we know that if we define two data matrices, x0 and x1, consisting of the first n-1 data points and the last n-1 data points respectively, okay, then this first bullet point implies that we can actually compute phi as this product, okay, and so from our data we can compute phi, and we know that phi should be given in terms of the exponential of the matrix of coefficients in our linear system in this way. I think this got cut off, sorry, but the bottom line is we should be able to, we have this relationship between phi and A. Okay, so we have something that we can compute from our data, and we have the thing that we want to know, the A. And so we can set these equal to each other, and it looks like we should just be able to find A by taking the matrix log of both sides. Okay, and in fact we can, but the matrix log is not quite as simple as just the usual log of a real number. Right? So everything in the linear case, in some sense, is going to boil down to matrix logarithms, and quite a bit was worked out for these matrix logs in some papers by Culver in the 1960s. Okay, so these are some interesting theorems that Culver proved that are extremely useful in this linear qualitative inverse problem. Okay, so for example, if we look at this matrix equation, right, phi equals e to the a, Culver showed that a real solution exists if and only if phi is non-singular and each of its Jordan blocks corresponding to a negative eigenvalue occurs an even number of times. Okay. Likewise, for existence and uniqueness, we need stronger conditions. We need all of the eigenvalues to be positive real with no repeated Jordan blocks. Okay, so looking at this second theorem, we can right away see a couple of different forms of non-uniqueness we can get. So one would be if we have this repetition of an eigenvalue, a Jordan block in the words of this theorem, right? So in fact, all of these matrices on the right-hand side, no matter what invertible matrix S we use, give us the same result when we exponentiate. And then there's this other form of non-uniqueness that we can run into, what we call countable non-uniqueness. Okay, any matrix of this form for an integer k gives us the same result when we exponentiate. Okay, so this is where the positive real eigenvalues come into play. All right, so yeah, and here's an example where we're in this non-uniqueness case. We have our 3 data points, 0, 1, and 2, and we can see 3 of the infinitely many solutions to, coefficient matrices for x dot equals ax that produce trajectories that go through these 3 data points. Okay, we can choose r equals 0, 1, or -1 and get the corresponding trajectories here. And they all have the same matrix exponential. All right, so we have to avoid this if we want to uniquely identify a parameter vector for our data points. If our data happens to give us a phi of this form, then we're just out of luck. We're not going to have a unique parameter matrix that produces a trajectory that goes through this data. All right. So yeah, we can build off of the Culver theorems to solve this problem for the linear case, and so we can make statements about whether this equation has a solution, a unique solution, no solution, depending on the nature of the spectrum of phi, the Jordan form of phi, and we can draw pictures like this in the 2D case, where again visualization is really convenient. So we can map from the determinant of phi and the trace of phi to the solution of the matrix log equation, which tells us what type of critical point our linear system will have that fits the data, or whether there just will not be a linear system in these DNA regions that fits the data. And then we can in turn look at this in terms of the possible coordinate locations for the third data point. So for example, if x0 is our first data point, x1 is our second data point, if we put the third data point anywhere in this plane, okay, then we can compute the corresponding phi, and from the information about the determinant and trace of phi, we can figure out what type of linear system we're going to have that fits the data, or whether we don't have any such linear system. Okay, so that was our starting point, and I see that I'm basically out of time, so I'm going to jump now. The history is that we built from here to affine systems. We also looked at this issue of robustness, but I'm not going to go into that. A lot of the results extend to affine systems, the systems of this form. And where we are now is that we've spent a lot of time thinking about a nonlinear system, because of course our goal is to do this for nonlinear systems. And so our starting point has been the Lotka-Volterra system, which is nonlinear, but in a special way. Okay, it's what's called linear in parameters, So each parameter just shows up as a coefficient in front of some term, possibly nonlinear term, on the right-hand side of the system. Okay, we decided to start with this system because it has that structure, and it's so widely used in biology, and it leads to this really interesting qualitative problem, which is, can we identify whether the interactions in this system are competitive, or predator-prey type, or cooperative, or that type of thing, without actually solving for the parameter values themselves. And so based on time, I don't really have time to say much, but I just want to point out, this picture turned out to be extremely useful for how we think about the nonlinear systems also. Okay, we're no longer in a regime where we can just look at a matrix log equation and say something. But what we can do is we can still keep thinking about, let's think in terms of where we could possibly put our final data point and look at the region of all possible locations of that data point and partition that plane into the possible outcomes that we're going to get, the type of linear system that we're going to get, the type of Lotka-Volterra system that we're going to get as a function of where that final data point sits. So let me just show you one picture like this and then jump to the conclusions. Okay, so here are the type of pictures that we've been getting, right? And it's quite rich, and we can prove certain things in these diagrams, and other ones are numerical. But you can see that we've identified in the space of the possible coordinates of a third data point for a 2D Lotka-Volterra system, given that the first two data points are here and here, what are the sign signatures of the coefficients of the system? Right, so we have 4 parameters, alpha 1, beta 1, beta 2, alpha 2. We have a sign signature for these 4 parameters, and we can color code this entire plane based on what sign we can determine the parameters have, as well as whether the trajectories for the system will be periodic, bounded or unbounded, and that type of thing. We also find these regions, which I've zoomed in on here, of non-uniqueness, where we can show that there's a form of non-trivial non-uniqueness of the solutions, the parameter sets that actually go through the data points when the data is in this region down here. Okay, so yeah, I have a lot here. I guess I went a little slow on the first part, but here's a summary of some results. Yeah, actually, I'm going to skip that and go right to the big picture conclusions. Okay, so the analysis of these qualitative inverse problems helps us understand the parameter data relationship for these types of systems that we've considered, with the third one being specifically the case study of Lotka-Volterra that we've recently published and that we hope to build off of moving forward. Okay, and so these are the types of information we get from these problems. And then going back to the lesson from the first part of the talk, please use the Jacobian prior when you're doing Bayesian parameter estimation in the future. And these are the excellent collaborators I've been able to work with on these projects. So I mentioned David Swiegen, Shelby and Zhao Yu were successful PhD students that we jointly advised who have gone on to other places now. And Sven and Gilles were collaborators on the medical side, especially in the earlier work. So thanks for your patience and attention. Sorry to go over a little bit, and I am done.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. Really interesting talk. We're open for questions now. You can either say it directly on the on Zoom, or you could write it on chat. It's up to you. Well, I mean, can I ask my first question, John? Since,
Sure.
Yeah. So with the Lotka-Volterra model, I mean, you're talking about these nonlinearities. Aren't you automatically you're assuming the type of nonlinearity that exists?
That's right.
That's number one. And the number two, you talked about this robustness versus uniqueness. Robustness and uniqueness. You're using 2 data points, right? How about if you have more than just 2 data points? How wouldn't that actually reduce the chances of having that issue altogether?
Yeah, so okay, so for your first question, notice that in this diagram, we have these non-existence regions, right? So if one were to be observing data from some populations or whatever, and find that, you know, the X and Y values were here on the first measurement, here on the second measurement, and say over here in NE4 on the third measurement, then you immediately know the Lotka-Volterra model is not the right model for producing this data, or for representing what's happening in the physical system that produced this data. And the good news is, at least for this third data point, right, because we have this connected region, we know that even if the measurement's off by a certain amount, it's not going to change our conclusion. What we would like to have is little, you know, tolerances around all three of the data points. And we have that for the linear case. So, you know, how much error can we tolerate in all three of the data points without changing our conclusion? Now, you're right. When we start changing the amount of data that we have to take that into account. And so it's harder to get a specific system to fit, you know, more data points. And so there's the trade-off where you're less likely to have non-uniqueness, but you're less likely to have existence as well.
Okay, thanks. I will talk more because I have a couple of more questions, but I'll give other people a chance. Andre, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, John. Thanks for the talk. In an experimental situation, you're going to have noise on your X0 and X1, or P0 and P1. So is there kind of a trade-off in trying to estimate the solution matrix from what you have so far and keep some of it as a, you know, kind of like a training and test set, like to figure out where it's going?
Okay, so I feel like maybe there are two issues in what you said, right? Again, the first is the noise in the data, which is related to Anwar's second question too. So yeah, so again, the way we set this up, we get a lot of information about how much noise we can tolerate in the final data point without changing our conclusions. We do have to assume there's some noise in the other data points, and my intuition is that right, if we know that, you know, our third data point, for example, was here, kind of very far from the boundaries of this region, and we do have a certain form of structural stability where if we were to vary P0 or P1 a little bit, you know, this diagram doesn't radically change. That's one of the really important issues to look at. And so as long as we're not right near the boundary here, in fact, we can infer that some noise in all of the data points is not going to change our conclusion. You mentioned another issue of keeping out some data as some sort of validation set or whatever, which is generally just like good practice, right, for parameter, you know, fitting in general. So here, because we're assuming our data is extremely limited, it's kind of the minimum amount we want to work with, we're not thinking about that issue, right? But ideally, like, if we had even more data, you know, we could try to draw conclusions about our system from, you know, the points that we have here, and then check if those conclusions are consistent with the additional data points, you know, relative to what we have here.
There's a question from the group. Yeah, go ahead.
So, thanks, John. I thought you were going to be in Montreal. I ran over to the seminar room to be here live.
Sorry.
I got a cross signal. I'm, you know, in along the course of time, the one time when I've been involved in trying to fit data seriously to a function was something that they do a lot in neuroscience, which is fitting decaying exponentials to, let's say, a sum of two. You know, if one doesn't fit well, they do a sum of two. Right. And the thing that I learned at that time, which I think is part of what your message was today, but I'm not sure, was that there was a large range of parameters. If you kind of reduce the space down to 2 appropriate parameters, you found that there was like a parabola in this parameter space, which was very, very good over any points along that parameter, but one point was better than the others. And then, you know, I think in the paper, we ended up choosing that one point. And of course, it doesn't, in most of these things, it actually doesn't make any difference what you get, because nobody really cares. Nobody's going to do anything with those parameters afterwards. Do you have any, I know that you deal with people who do things in neuroscience a lot. Do you have any comments about that and the parameter fitting in neuroscience, where they're fitting patch clamp data to sum of two exponentials and so forth? And do those numbers actually ever make a real difference?
Interesting. I mean, so yeah, in neuroscience, typically there's a lot more data than what I'm talking about here. So
And it's good data, but it's reasonable.
Yeah, that does change the playing field a little bit, but it makes, it's the first part of my talk is very relevant, right? Where if you have this situation where there's many parameter sets that kind of do similarly well, and you pick one and forget about the others, then when you get more data, you might find yourself on the wrong path, right? Because in fact, the new data is not consistent with the one that you picked, but it would have been much more consistent with some of the other options. As far as whether these choices actually matter, I mean, yeah, I think that traditionally, in my experience, in like Hodgkin-Huxley style models, some of these parameters are some of the most sensitive ones, right? Some of these like half activations and slopes of these activation functions. When people put heterogeneity in models, they're usually putting it into conductances or something like that, where you expect more robustness. But I think those values actually can matter quite a bit.
So when people do a least squares fit to the exponential, let's say sum of 2 exponentials, do the techniques that you're developing, would they change what numbers they came up with, or would you encourage people to report things as a probability distribution of parameters? How would that change?
Yeah, right.
There must be hundreds of papers with people
Right.
tail currents to sum of 2 exponentials or whatever.
Right.
My colleague Alvin
Right.
has had many papers and lots of people.
Yeah, it's a great thought. It's a great philosophical question, I would say. I mean,
Practical.
I know. Okay.
I mean,
ideally, yeah. I mean, ideally, we should be recognizing that we sort of have a distribution over these parameters, and if we want to build, if we want to run simulations either of single neurons or of networks, we should be sampling from these distributions rather than just picking one set of parameters and going forward with that. But that's not very practical.
I think it depends on the goal of what the problem that you're dealing with. I personally think.
Say it again.
How it depends on what your objective is. What is what you're trying to accomplish in the problem that you're solving.
Yeah.
Most people are trying to get a paper published, and
and there's one more question. We can go to the next question. So Dominique, go ahead. You're just running out of time. Yeah.
Hey, it's funny because I'm kind of in line with that. My question was, how do you think your method here would kind of fit in the context where we have a model that's kind of technically over-parameterized according to whatever I guess, computational resources we have, or what kind of amount of data that we have. And so the specific kind of parameters that you select is going to affect the kind of mapping that you're going to get there with the specific discrete, I guess, qualitative state. And in the same line, if you have like something like a brain network model, you might not know what those discrete qualitative behaviors might look like, depending on which kind of parameters you freeze and which one you don't. And so in that context, do you think this kind of approach would be reasonable? Could it be adapted to fit this kind of problem?
Yeah, so I think that's a setting in which, again, like trying to keep alive a whole parameter distribution makes a lot of sense, because you're not justified. You don't have, you're saying you don't have enough data to really constrain your parameters, right?
Well, it would be kind of more in a case where you have so many parameters that it might just not be a good idea to try to fit them all for multiple reasons. Not having enough data would be one, but it could also be just computational resources. Like you can do inference on 1,000-something parameters just with the resources.
So there's, I mean, there's additional steps I didn't talk about, forms of sensitivity analysis and whatnot that would then come into play so that you could maybe choose which subset of your parameters you want to fit and which ones you want to freeze. As far as the qualitative case, then, yeah, I mean, yeah, you're not equipped, I would say, to say much on the qualitative side if you're in that situation, because you have so much ambiguity in where your parameters might lie. So I always think of that as a situation where you really need more data to pin things down. But claiming a specific parameter set in that case seems like a really bad idea, because you're completely clear. You clearly know that you don't have enough information to pin down your parameters. So claiming one is the best or correct choice seems really ill-advised. Again, like a lot of this motivation comes from more medical type applications or ecological with far less data than we typically have in neuroscience. And so there, the message is kind of trying to keep a parameter distribution and think in terms of ensembles of parameter sets to kind of represent whatever heterogeneity is present or whatever ambiguity is present in the information that you have at the moment. And with additional data, you may be able to narrow those down or tighten those distributions up, but you don't want to throw them away too early. And you don't want to bias them with the wrong prior.
Okay, with that, we'd like to thank Jonathan again for really a very interesting talk. Probably if you have more questions, perhaps you could talk to him by email. I'm pretty sure he'll be happy to respond. For one thing, I'll be contacting you by email because I have some more questions.
Yeah.
Thank you very much again.
Actually, it would have been a case where it would have been fun to be there in person, because I think we could have had some long, interesting,
hopefully next
discussions.
Yes, absolutely. Next year,
next time.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
All right.
Okay. Happy Thanksgiving, and we'll see you around. Yeah. Bye.